Hello there, everybody. This week we start in on the poet John Donne, and as such, we also start in on the subgenre of English poetry from the 17th century that's often referred to as metaphysical poetry. The metaphysical poetry was prominent from the early to the mid 17th century. It certainly was not the only style of poetry at the time, but it is one that has remained really important and influential on poets right down to the present day. The metaphysical poets had a number of key traits that sort of define them as a group. And the three members of the group that we're reading are John Donne today, and then next week we'll be looking at George Herbert and then also the poet Andrew Marvell. Um, the metaphysical poets tend to be a fairly highly intellectual group of poets. These tend to be very complicated poems. There's a kind of puzzle-like quality to them. I mean, personally, I really like these poets, and I think it's like the same part of me that sort of likes games and puzzles, likes the metaphysical poets. You're often trying to sort of put pieces together and puzzle things out. They're known for writing poems that are often a little bit more speech-like than song-like. They're contemporaries of poets like Christopher Marlowe or Ben Jonson, who we've read earlier in the semester. Those poets who are not part of the metaphysical group, they tend to be a little bit more sing-songy and musical in their approaches. That isn't really how the metaphysicals work. Though the metaphysicals are highly intellectual, their favorite topics to write about tend to be very intensely emotional, personal topics. They write about religion, they write about death, they write about love, they write about sex. Many of the best poems about all of these topics come from the metaphysical group, and we'll be talking about them in the next few days. Um, if metaphysical poetry is known for one stylistic trait more than anything else, it's undoubtedly what's called a conceit. A conceit is a literary term for a sort of lengthy, extended metaphor, right? I mean, if I just say, you have ruby lips, that's not a conceit. That's just kind of a basic metaphor. But metaphors that unfold over the course of lots of lines, or maybe even the space of a whole poem, a metaphor of that length is a conceit. So, for instance, with Donne today, there's a lengthy section in Holy Sonnet 14 where he's talking about himself as a town that's been taken over by the devil, and he needs God to come riding in to liberate this town. And so all of that is like a metaphor for him giving into sin and needing his soul to be saved. But it takes a lot of lines for that to lay out. Or also when we look at George Herbert next time, Herbert's The Flower, for instance, is effectively the whole poem is a series of conceits where he sort of considers the flower as meaning potentially different things metaphorically in his spiritual life. The metaphysicals have been profoundly influential, but also a profoundly divisive group of poets down through the centuries. A century later, in the 18th century, the literary critic Samuel Johnson, who's famous, among other things, for creating one of the first important English dictionaries, Johnson didn't much care for this group of poets and said that in their poems, and here he's really talking about the elaborate metaphors, he says that in their poems, quote, the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together, which is basically a fancy way of saying that they take things that don't have anything to do with each other, i.e., a town being taken over by an invading army and sin, and then create these sort of elaborate metaphorical constructions that compare these things. And Johnson felt that that was kind of overly intellectual and got in the way of the feeling. On the other hand, the poet and critic T.S. Eliot, who wrote in the early 20th century and who we'll be reading later in the semester. Eliot really liked the Metaphysicals, and indeed they were probably the most important influence on his poetry, and actually a very important influence on lots of early 20th century poetry. And what Eliot liked about the Metaphysicals was that he felt like in the Metaphysicals that there was what he called a unity of thought and feeling. That he felt like in lots of places in our culture we tend to put thinking in one box and feeling in another box, and that there's something really destructive to the idea of being a full person in separating those things. And that what makes the Metaphysicals really important to Eliot is that they combine them. They're kind of using their intellects to think through their emotions in these poems that, yes, are intellectually complicated, but are also dealing with really heavily emotional topics. I mean, just in the Donne poems that we're reading for today, we have a poem about Donne going away on a trip and missing his wife, and he's really emotional about that. Or, we also have the Holy Sonnets, which are really searingly intense religious poems about Donne's desire for redemption and his fear of death and so on and so forth. So anyway, those are sort of the stakes at play in the metaphysical poets. So read around in Donne. There's fun stuff here. It's tricky stuff, but play around with it and we'll talk about it in class and on the message boards.